What challenges do the two teenage cancer patients face as they embark on a life-affirming journey to meet a reclusive author in Amsterdam? Welcome back to Movie Recap World. Today we will take a look at the movie The Fault in Our Stars, released in 2014. If you're ready, let's begin. A young girl named Hazel Grace Lancaster lies on the grass, gazing at the stars. While she believes that we are allowed to choose how we tell our sad stories and that there is nothing that can't be fixed by being coated with sugar and a Peter Gabriel song, she points out that it is not true. Hazel suffers from stage 4 thyroid cancer and is always seen carrying an oxygen tank with a cannula in her nose to help her breathe. Following the orders of her mother Franny, her father Michael, and her doctor Maria, she joins a cancer support group at a church called the Literal Heart of Jesus. The person leading the group is a man named Patrick, who had testicular cancer and is now divorced and living with his family, but remains positive about life. Franny wants Hazel to make friends, but as Hazel says, the only thing worse than having cancer is having a child who has been bitten by cancer. During a visit to the support group, Hazel meets Augustus Waters one day. Gus is looking at her during the meeting. Patrick initially calls his friend Isaac, who had a tumor in his eye and now wears a glass eye, but he is grateful to his hot girlfriend Monica. When Gus is called, he says he is in remission from osteosarcoma after having half of his right leg amputated and he wears a prosthetic. Patrick asks if he has any fears and Gus mentions his fears are being forgotten. Hazel hits him by saying that eventually everything and everyone will go away and be forgotten, and if that scares him, he needs to ignore it. After the meeting, Hazel waits for her mother and Gus comes out to talk to her. They see Isaac and Monica making out and fumbling each other, then saying always to each other. Gus explains to Hazel that this is their way of saying they will always love each other. He asks for her name and tells her that she is beautiful. Later, he puts a cigarette in his mouth, which upsets Hazel because it ruins the impression she had of him. Gus explains that he never lights or smokes the cigarettes he puts between his teeth to avoid giving power to the killing thing. He invites Hazel to watch a movie with him. As Gus recklessly speeds toward his house, he inquires of Hazel about her journey with cancer. She recounts through a series of flashbacks her diagnosis at the tender age of 13 and the extensive treatment she endured. Despite the efforts, the treatment proved ineffective, causing her lungs to fill with water, leading to a stay in the ICU. However, a miraculous turn of events occurred when the medication she received began to show promising results. Hazel and Gus finally reach his residence, where they encounter his parents. Taking Hazel to the basement, Gus urges her to unveil her true narrative, distinct from her cancer story. Initially dismissing herself as unremarkable, Hazel's claims are promptly dismissed by Gus. As a token of his affection, Gus gives her a copy of his beloved book inspired by his favorite video game, Counterinsurgents. In return, Hazel recommends her cherished read, An Imperial Affliction, cautioning Gus that it surpasses the boundaries of a mere cancer tale. Anxiously awaiting Gus's response, Hazel receives a text from him after several days, expressing astonishment upon completing An Imperial Affliction. Intriguingly, the book concludes mid-sentence, with the protagonist Anna seemingly passing away during her own narration. Excusing herself from dinner, Hazel engages Gus in a phone conversation, though they are interrupted by Isaac's mournful wails of a song lyric in the background. Gus extends an invitation to Hazel to join them, where she learns of Monica's breakup with Isaac just before his impending operation to remove his remaining eye, citing her inability to cope with the repercussions. While Gus refers to Isaac's behavior as a psychotic episode, Hazel maintains that his response is within the realm of normalcy. In an act of catharsis, Gus permits Isaac to vent his frustration by smashing his basketball trophies. Amidst Isaac's emotional release, Gus engages Hazel in a discussion about the book's conclusion. In response, Hazel reveals that she has composed numerous letters to the author Peter Van Houten, seeking answers regarding the aftermath of the story, such as the fate of Anna's mother, her relationship with the enigmatic Dutch tulip man, and the well-being of Anna's pet hamster, Sisyphus. During an evening phone call, Gus shares with Hazel his successful endeavor of locating Van Houten's assistant and receiving a response to their message. Peter Van Houten expresses gratitude for their interest in Imperial Affliction, but states that he currently has no plans for any follow-up works. Hazel is taken aback by the fact that a single email prompted a response. Determined to seek answers, she decides to compose her own email to Van Houten. After a few days, Hazel receives a reply from Van Houten expressing appreciation for her engagement with the story and extending an invitation to visit him in Amsterdam. Overjoyed, Hazel shares the news with her mother, who, although wanting to make her daughter happy, acknowledges the financial constraints that prevent such a journey. Later, Hazel reads Van Houten's email aloud to Gus, and their conversation continues into the late hours until they finally decide it's time to hang up. Okay, Gus responds. Okay, echoes Hazel, and they agree that okay can be their symbol of everlasting connection. Excitedly, Hazel informs Gus about the invitation, and he suggests reaching out to an organization like Make-A-Wish to grant her this wish. However, Hazel reveals that she had already used her wish to visit Disney World, disappointing Gus, who considers it a cliche choice. Sometime later, Gus surprises Hazel at her home bearing orange tulips and wearing a basketball jersey of Rick Smits, the renowned Dutch player. He invites her on a picnic to a park featuring an enormous skeletal playground known as Funky Bones, a replica of a Dutch artist's work. Playfully, Gus jokes about his romantic encounters out the park, humorously drawing circles in the dirt to represent virgins and 18-year-old boys. As they enjoy their picnic, Gus reveals that he spoke to genies and successfully convinced them to grant his wish of taking Hazel to Amsterdam. Her joy knows no bounds. However, Hazel's blissful night is interrupted as she wakes up struggling to breathe, her lungs filling with fluid. Hastily, her parents rush her to the hospital, where Gus anxiously waits outside due to restricted access limited to family members only. Hazel undergoes a procedure to drain the fluid from her lungs and gradually recovers. In a subsequent meeting with the doctors, they conclude that her physical condition renders her unable to travel anywhere. In this moment, Hazel experiences a flashback to her time in the ICU as a child, recalling Franny's words, encouraging her to let go and tearfully lamenting to Michael about the loss of her future as a mother. Feeling downhearted, Hazel withdraws from Gus, ignoring his phone calls and text messages. She finds solace in the backyard swing her father had constructed when she was a child. Eventually, Hazel musters the courage to call Gus and confess her sadness. Understanding her need for space, Gus joins her on the swing and reassures her that his affection for her remains unwavering. Hazel, likening herself to a destructive grenade, decides that to protect Gus from potential harm, they should remain friends. A few days later, Levi, Van Houten's assistant, contacts Hazel via email once again, extending the invitation to Amsterdam after learning about their upcoming trip. Hazel summons her mother, sharing the news that they will indeed be embarking on the journey. Franny had planned to surprise Hazel alongside her father, but the secret is out. Overwhelmed with emotion, Hazel embraces her mother and promptly texts Gus. His response, "Everything is coming up waters," fills her with hope. Determined, she gazes at her lungs, urging them to hold themselves together for at least a week. In a grand gesture, Gus arrives in a limousine to pick Hazel and Franny, eager to travel in style. Nervous yet excited, Gus experiences the thrill of his first ever plane ride once they take off. When Hazel gives him a gentle peck on the cheek, Franny finds their affection adorable. On their inaugural day in Amsterdam, Hazel and Gus enjoy a picturesque canal ride and dine at the Dutch restaurant Orangie. Hazel dons a beautiful blue dress gifted to her by Franny, while Gus astoundedly admires her beauty in his sleek suit. As they enter the restaurant, they are warmly greeted as Mr. and Mrs. Waters serve Dom Perignon champagne for the first time, which they savor. During their delightful dinner, Gus unabashedly professes his love for Hazel, causing her face to light up with joy. To their surprise, the waiter brings more champagne, revealing that the entire dinner has been graciously covered by Van Houten. On the following day, Hazel and Gus make their way to meet Van Houten. Levi warmly greets them at the door, and as they enter, they notice a scattered mess of unopened fan mail covering the floor. They locate Van Houten, dressed in his pajamas and sipping on scotch. Taking a seat, they hope for meaningful answers to their questions. However, Van Houten surprises them by ordering Levi to play Swedish rap music, which blares loudly in the background. Undeterred by the distractions, Hazel begins to inquire about Anna's mother and the Dutch tulip man. Disappointingly, Van Houten responds with nonsensical philosophical remarks. Gus, growing frustrated, questions whether Van Houten is intentionally toying with them. Unfortunately, Van Houten's behavior worsens as he makes an insensitive comment about Gus's cancer, refusing to address Hazel's questions and further insulting their illness. Fed up, Hazel and Gus storm out, leaving Van Houten behind. In response to Van Houten's query about why she dwells on such questions, Hazel boldly tells him to go to hell. Appalled by Van Houten's behavior, Levi, showing genuine concern, offers to accompany Hazel and Gus to the Anne Frank house. As they arrive, Hazel realizes that there are no elevators, forcing her to exert herself and climb the stairs and ladders, which strains her breathing. They reach the floor where Anne Frank's vocal recordings are played, sharing her thoughts and writings about finding beauty and happiness amidst difficult circumstances. In this poignant moment, Hazel and Gus share their first kiss, eliciting applause from onlookers, including Levi. Returning to Gus's room, their love deepens as they make love for the first time. Before parting ways, Hazel leaves Gus with a drawing depicting the large circle of virgins, with the small circle inside representing 18-year-old boys with one leg outside the main circle. On their final day in Amsterdam, Hazel and Gus enjoy breakfast with Franny before taking a walk alone together. They find respite on a bench where Gus musters the courage to share news he knows Hazel is already aware of. He reveals that he underwent a PET scan and the results showed the cancer had returned and spread throughout his body, illuminating like a Christmas tree. Overwhelmed with grief, Hazel rests her head on Gus's shoulder and sheds a tear. In an attempt to lighten the heavy atmosphere, Gus suggests they make out, seeking solace in their love for one another. Hazel, Gus, and Franny return to Indianapolis, where Michael picks them up. A few days later, they meet up with Isaac, who is now completely blind, and shares that Monica hasn't spoken to him since their breakup. To lift Isaac's spirit, Hazel and Gus decide to buy eggs and head to Monica's house, allowing Isaac to throw eggs at her car. In the middle of the night, Gus calls Hazel and asks for her help at the gas station. She rushes over to find Gus in his car, covered in mucus and vomit, suffering from an infection in his abdomen due to the G-tube. He wants to buy a new pack of cigarettes since he can't find his old one. Despite Gus's plea, Hazel calls an ambulance. The paramedics arrive and take Gus to the hospital where he continues to receive treatment for cancer. Eventually, the doctors decide to stop the chemotherapy. Now, Hazel is the one who is denied access to Gus's hospital room since she is not a family member. Gus now relies on a wheelchair for mobility. Hazel takes Gus to the park with the Funky Bones replica for a picnic. During their time together, Gus expresses his desire to leave a lasting impact on the world before he passes away, yearning for an extraordinary life. This statement upsets Hazel as she reminds him that he doesn't need to do grand things to be loved and valued. She reassures him that she, as well as his parents, love him deeply, and that should be enough. Gus apologizes and they share a moment sipping champagne. On another evening, Gus calls Hazel to invite her to the literal heart of Jesus for a gathering and asks her to bring the eulogy she wrote for him. As Hazel prepares to leave, she is stopped by her parents who are setting up dinner. A heated argument ensues as Hazel expresses her fear of leaving and leaving them alone. Franny surprises Hazel by acknowledging her previous statement and assuring her that she will always be her mother even after Hazel's passing. Both of her parents declare their unwavering love for her regardless of what happens and reveal that Franny is taking classes to become a social worker to support families going through a similar experience. Hazel is filled with relief knowing that her parents will find fulfillment even after she is gone. Hazel joins Gus and Isaac at the church for a unique event that Gus refers to as a pre-funeral, as he wants to witness his own funeral. Isaac begins the eulogy with a touch of humor, but quickly expresses that he would refuse robot eyes because he cannot bear to see a world without Gus. Hazel takes her turn and starts by sharing their love story before delving into the concept of mathematics, discussing the infinite numbers between 0 and 1 and the countless infinites that exist. She expresses her gratitude for their shared infinity, and with tears in their eyes, they both say their final I love you to each other. Tragically, Gus passes away 8 days later. In the middle of the night, the Lancaster family receives a phone call delivering the heartbreaking news. Without a word being spoken, Hazel's parents enter her room and she immediately understands what has happened, breaking down in tears. Amidst her grief, Hazel recalls a moment during her treatment when a nurse asked her to rate her pain on a scale from 1 to 10. At the time, she rated it a 9, but the nurse commended her for calling it a 9 instead of a 10, believing she was showing resilience. However, Hazel reveals that she wasn't being brave then, she was saving her 10 for this exact moment of profound pain. A funeral is held for Gus and Hazel attends with her parents. Surprisingly, Van Houten is also present. As the preacher delivers his words, Hazel notices Van Houten's unexpected presence. When called up to speak, she corrects the preacher, identifying herself as Gus's girlfriend. Placing a pack of cigarettes amidst the flowers on his coffin, she presents a new eulogy that she finds more fitting for the public gathering. Following the funeral, Hazel decides to drive home alone, only to find Van Houten entering her car. In their conversation, she learns that Gus had been in contact with Van Houten prior to his death, and Gus had asked Van Houten to redeem himself by visiting Hazel and answering her lingering questions. Van Houten reveals that Anna was inspired by his 8-year-old daughter, who tragically succumbed to leukemia. Filled with fury, Hazel angrily dismisses Van Houten from her car. As she drives away, she catches a glimpse of him drinking from his flask in the car's rearview mirror, leaving their encounter behind. Hazel's father comes to offer his comfort to her in the aftermath of Gus's passing. Later, Isaac pays her a visit, sharing that Gus truly loved her and couldn't stop talking about her, even to the point of it becoming annoying. He asks Hazel if she read the letter from Van Houten, which turns out to be a letter written by Gus himself. She realizes that the crumpled letter she discarded in the car was actually a heartfelt eulogy for her penned by Gus. As Gus's voice narrates the letter, he describes how he quietly entered Hazel's room in the ICU while she slept, holding her hand and envisioning their future together. He expresses his profound admiration for her beauty, personality, and strength. Gus reflects on the power we have to choose who can hurt us, and he reveals that he made his choice and hoped Hazel felt the same about hers. He concludes the letter with a simple question, "Okay, Hazel Grace?" The film concludes with Hazel lying in the grass, gazing up at the stars as she responds with a soft yet resolute voice, "Okay." And the movie ends here. If you enjoyed, please consider like and subscribing. See you in the next one.